Let's start at the beginning, because before an empath becomes dangerous to a narcissist, before they reclaim themselves, set boundaries, or go no contact, something critical has to happen. They have to see. They have to awaken to the truth. And that's not some sentimental metaphor. It's a profound psychological shift, and it's often one of the most painful and disorienting experiences of their life. You see, empaths, real empaths, aren't just kind people. They're deeply attuned to the emotional frequencies of others. They listen between the lines, they feel what isn't said, and they're wired, often from very early experiences, to prioritize emotional connection over personal comfort. That makes them incredibly compassionate, but also incredibly vulnerable, especially to people who weaponize emotion as a means of control. That's where the narcissist enters the picture. At first, the narcissist and the empath seem like a perfect fit. The narcissist craves admiration, validation, and someone who will revolve around their emotional needs. The empath is often eager to give, to help, to heal, to understand. And the narcissist knows exactly how to present themselves. Charming, wounded, magnetic, even profound. In fact, it's that very ability to mirror the empath's deepest ideals and values that hooks them in. It creates the illusion of depth, of connection, of mutual care. But it's all a performance. It's a carefully constructed mask designed to extract attention and control. What's tragic, and I use that word deliberately, is how long an empath will stay in that illusion. Not because they're naive, but because they believe. They believe in the power of love to heal. They believe in the redemptive potential of wounded people. They believe, fundamentally, that if they give enough time, enough patience, enough of themselves, they'll reach the real person behind the narcissist's defenses. They don't realize that for the narcissist, the mask is the person. There's nothing deeper to reach. There's only strategy. But here's where everything begins to shift. Over time, the empath starts to notice inconsistencies, subtle at first. A lie that didn't need to be told. An absence of empathy at a critical moment. A tendency to turn the blame always back on them. These small cracks accumulate. And if the empath is honest with themselves, painfully honest, they start to question what they're actually dealing with. That's the start of the awakening. Now, awakening isn't glamorous. It's not a neat little moment of insight. It's destabilizing, because to truly see the narcissist for what they are, the empath has to confront the fact that the entire emotional foundation of the relationship was based on an illusion. They weren't seen, valued, or loved. They were used. That's a brutal truth, and one that cuts deeply into the empath's sense of self. But paradoxically, that pain becomes the gateway to clarity. Because in order to move forward, they have to revise their understanding, not just of the narcissist, but of themselves. Why did I stay? Why did I ignore the signs? What was I trying to prove? What was I afraid to lose? Those questions are not signs of weakness. They're signs of emerging strength. Because the moment you ask those questions honestly, you stop focusing on saving the narcissist and start focusing on saving yourself. You begin to reclaim your perception, your reality, yourself. And that's what makes the empath dangerous. Because once they've seen through the narcissist mask, they can't unsee it. That particular spell is broken. The narcissist senses this shift, often before the empath even fully understands it themselves. They become more controlling, more reactive, more desperate to reestablish dominance. But it's already too late. The empath is no longer responding to the fantasy. They're analyzing it. And with each realization, the narcissist's power diminishes. So if you're waking up, if you're starting to question what once felt unshakable, don't run from that discomfort. Lean into it. Because pain that reveals the truth is infinitely more valuable than comfort that preserves the lie. And once you see clearly, you can begin to choose differently. That's the first step in becoming not only free, but formidable. Want to dive deeper into the psychology of narcissists and empaths? Check out Toxic Confessions for raw, unfiltered stories of survival and reclaiming power. After the initial awakening, after the empath finally sees the narcissist for who they are, something else begins to happen. And it's equally transformative. It's a shift from emotional dependency to detachment. And make no mistake, this is not a casual process. It's not simply about cutting ties or walking away. It's a deep psychological restructuring. It's the undoing of years, sometimes decades of conditioning. Because what's really being broken is not just the relationship with a narcissist, but the relationship the empath has with their own patterns of self-sacrifice, guilt, and emotional overinvestment. Now, this may sound counterintuitive to people unfamiliar with these dynamics, but the empath, despite their pain, often feels a kind of attachment to the narcissist's approval. Why? Because the narcissist doesn't just manipulate emotions. They shape identity. They create an ecosystem where the empath's worth is constantly being questioned, measured, and judged based on how well they cater to the narcissist's shifting needs. This fosters a cycle of emotional dependency that feels like love but is actually control. And this is where we can borrow a little from depth psychology. Carl Jung wrote that what you most need will be found where you least want to look. In the case of the empath, what they most need is to reclaim their autonomy. But doing that requires confronting their fear of abandonment, of being seen as selfish, of no longer being the emotional caretaker. Because that role, the fixer, the healer, the forgiver, has become tied to their identity. The narcissist exploits that over and over again. So what does a shift actually look like? It begins with moments, small, quiet, internal acts of resistance. The empath starts to say no, not out loud at first, but within themselves. They begin to question, why am I apologizing for their behavior? Why do I feel guilty for wanting space? Why am I the one always making peace? These questions become wedges, psychological tools that loosen the grip of enmeshment. And that's the beginning of emotional detachment. Now, it's important to distinguish detachment from indifference. Detachment doesn't mean the empath suddenly stops feeling. In fact, they may feel even more intensely during this period. But what changes is the ownership of those emotions. The empath begins to understand that their feelings don't need to be managed or approved by the narcissist, that their emotional world is their own and not a playground for someone else's projections and manipulation. And the narcissist, who has relied on the empath's emotional responsiveness, senses this loss of control immediately. That's when the tactics intensify. Guilt-tripping love bombing, rage silence, anything to reestablish the old dance. But the empath, now increasingly grounded in their own self-awareness, begins to see these tactics not as proof of love, but as evidence of dysfunction. That's a major turning point. When the empath no longer interprets intensity as intimacy, they stop participating in the game. This shift also represents something philosophically profound. It's the reorientation of meaning. In a narcissistic relationship, meaning is always externalized. It's about how the narcissist sees you, responds to you, defines you. But in detachment, the empath turns inward. They begin to create meaning based on truth, not approval. Based on integrity, not compliance. That's existential freedom. And it's terrifying to the narcissist because it means they are no longer the center of gravity. And here's where we circle back to the idea of danger. A detached empath is dangerous, not because they retaliate, but because they become immune. The narcissist's words, once heavy with influence, lose their power. The silent treatment no longer wounds. It's seen for what it is, a tactic. The praise, the rage, the cycles of affection and punishment, they all become transparent. And once something is seen clearly, it can't control you in the same way. So if you're in that stage, if you feel the pull to distance, to reclaim your center, understand that it's not selfish. It's sacred. It's the return to your own authority. And that's what the narcissist fears most. Not your anger, not your absence, but your autonomy. Because the moment you stop needing their validation is the moment you become free, and free, truly free. The empath is not just surviving. It's the beginning of true strength. For more on breaking free from toxic dynamics, grab your copy of Toxic Confessions, where truth meets liberation. After the empath awakens to the truth and begins the difficult process of detachment, something remarkable and often misunderstood happens next. They stop reacting. And I don't mean they become numb or indifferent. I mean they withdraw their participation from the narcissist's psychological game. That's not apathy. That's strategy. It's power. It's the moment the empath chooses silence over justification. stillness over conflict, and peace over proving their point. And that, paradoxically, is what makes the empath more threatening to the narcissist than ever before. You have to understand how this dynamic is structured. The narcissist doesn't function in a vacuum. Their entire mode of being is relational, but not in a healthy, reciprocal sense. It's reactive. They need an emotional counterpoint. They require someone to manipulate, to bait, to control, because that's how they regulate their own fractured sense of self. It's not just about dominance. It's about affirmation. If they can get you to cry, rage, chase, or explain yourself endlessly, they feel real. They feel powerful. They feel in control. So when the empath, who was once the perfect emotional mirror, suddenly refuses to engage, not out of spite, but out of clarity, the narcissist is thrown into chaos. That silence, that refusal to respond, is not passive. It's an act of emotional rebellion. It communicates something devastating. You no longer have access to me. This is why the no contact rule, or even low contact, in cases where full detachment isn't possible, is so effective and so feared by narcissists, because it robs them of the one thing they crave above all else: emotional leverage. When you stop answering the late-night texts, when you no longer defend yourself against their false accusations, when you stop explaining your choices, your feelings, your boundaries, you are, in essence, reclaiming your psychological space. And you're forcing the narcissist to confront a truth they've spent their life avoiding: that their control only works when someone plays along. This is not to say that going silent is easy. In fact, it may be one of the hardest things the empath ever does. Because for people who are deeply wired for connection and empathy, disengaging can feel cold or cruel. It goes against their instinct to resolve, to mend, to seek closure. But here's the hard philosophical truth. Closure doesn't come from the narcissist. It comes from choosing to stop needing anything from them. Not the apology, not the explanation, not even acknowledgement. And this is where the empath moves from reaction to sovereignty. Because silence in this context is not just the absence of words. It's the presence of boundaries. It's a declaration of autonomy. And more importantly, it's a message to the self. I no longer allow dysfunction to define my emotional landscape. Now, predictably, the narcissist will not take this well. They may escalate, using guilt, charm, threats, or feigned vulnerability. They may frame your silence as abuse, as betrayal, as emotional immaturity. And that's where the empath must hold the line. Because this is not about proving who's right. It's about protecting your peace. Narcissists thrive on drama because it keeps the focus on them, removing your energy, your attention, your presence. That's how you shift the center of gravity back to yourself. There's a deeper psychological and even spiritual implication here, too. When you choose silence over reactivity, you're engaging in an act of individuation. Jung would call it the process of becoming whole. You're no longer a projection screen for someone else's unresolved wounds. You're no longer a character in their narrative. You're your own person. And in that stillness, in that refusal to perform, the narcissist is left to face the one person they've been running from all along: themselves. So if you find yourself tempted to respond, to justify, to clarify, to fight for your version of the story, ask yourself, what am I really trying to win? Because the real victory isn't being heard by the narcissist. It's being free from needing to be heard by them at all. Silence, when it comes from a place of strength, is not withdrawal. It's elevation. And for the empath who's done, it's not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of a new life. Ready to reclaim your power? Toxic Confessions is your guide to breaking free. Get your copy today. There comes a point in the empath's journey where the silence has done its work, the internal boundaries have solidified, and the psychological fog has lifted. And it's at this point, this very specific moment, that something the narcissist never expected begins to happen. The empath finds their voice. Not the reactive voice that once scrambled to explain, soothe, please, or defend. I'm talking about the integrated voice. The one that speaks not from a place of fear or entanglement, but from a place of deep knowing. The kind of voice that says no more and actually means it. Now, to fully understand the impact of this, we need to look at the dynamic structure of the narcissistic relationship. For the narcissist, power is maintained through dominance and confusion. Their control relies heavily on disorientation, Emotional manipulation, gaslighting, rewriting history, turning clarity into conflict. If they can keep the empath questioning their reality, they win. But once the empath finds their voice, they stop asking for permission to see clearly. They stop asking for validation to feel what they feel. They begin to name things as they are. That's a radical shift. And here's the philosophical depth of it. To name something is to define it, to place it within a coherent frame of meaning. In mythological terms, that's creation. That's power. When the empath says this was abuse, or this was manipulation, or even simply this was not love, they're no longer living in the narrative written for them by the narcissist. They're rewriting the story. They're reclaiming authorship. This act of naming, of speaking truth, is what the narcissist fears most. Because when the empath was silent, when they internalized the confusion, the narcissist could pretend they still had control. But once the empath speaks from clarity, the illusion collapses. There's no more plausible deniability, no more projection. The game is over, and the narcissist knows it. Now, this voice doesn't always manifest in dramatic confrontation. Often it's subtle. It's the refusal to respond to the bait. It's the way the empath speaks to others, with coherence, without shame. It's how they tell the story of what happened, not to get revenge, but to restore truth. And the more they speak, the more they integrate. The more they integrate, the stronger they become. And let me be clear, this voice isn't about vilifying the narcissist. It's about validating reality. For too long, the empath has lived in a world where their intuition was dismissed, their pain was minimized, their perceptions were distorted. Finding their voice is about refusing to live in that distortion any longer. It's about aligning words with truth, language with integrity. This is psychologically significant too, because language is how we make sense of experience. Trauma that remains unnamed stays lodged in the body, in the nervous system, in the subconscious. But trauma that is named, articulated, contextualized, that trauma can be integrated. That's how healing begins to take root. When the empath finds the words, they begin to metabolize the pain into wisdom. They stop carrying it as shame and start carrying it as knowledge. And knowledge is power. And, of course, once the empath begins to speak clearly, they become a kind of threat. Not physically, not aggressively, but existentially. They reflect the narcissist's failure, not just as a partner or friend or parent, but as a human being attempting to control another through deception. The empath, now armed with truth, becomes evidence. Their existence is proof that the mask didn't hold, that the game didn't last, that the manipulation didn't succeed indefinitely. So for those who have walked this difficult path, the challenge and the gift is this: to maintain these boundaries with compassion, firmness, and grace. To understand that saying no is not rejection, but preservation. That self-care is not selfishness, but a prerequisite for genuine empathy. And that the most powerful message you can send to a narcissist, or to anyone who tries to diminish your light, is the quiet, unwavering signal of your own sovereignty. Because, in the end, the most dangerous person to a narcissist is not a confrontational warrior or a vengeful opponent. It's an empath who has said no more, and through that decision, has reclaimed themselves completely. For more raw truths and unfiltered stories of survival, grab Toxic Confessions, your roadmap to freedom.